This is the story of Amelia's Tears by Sara, read by A.K. Wild. Chapter 1. Torment and Anguish. The clanging of the big door slammed shut for the night made Amelia jump. She sat on the side of the sleeping pallet, rocking with her eyes closed. A tear fell unnoticed onto the thin blanket covering her knees. It was her last night in the female factory in Parramatta. Memories of the past came flooding back. These made more tears slide unchecked down her cheek. It was as though she was back in London. She thought the jail in London was terrible enough until sent to the hulks in the Thames River. The memory of the smell was enough to make her dry wrench. She had known back then she would spend the following months, if not years, below the deck and locked into the filthy creatures that she had walked alongside. With her eyes closed, she imagined that she would hear the sounds of trampling feet and the jangles of chains of the women who were marched down from the jail to the river. The memory of the sheer, absolute horror of what had befallen her was overwhelming when she finally viewed the temporary destination. Each woman had their eyes focused on the stinking, rotten ship's hull that was moored into the middle of the river. The stench was being able to detect from the riverbanks. She remembered thinking that she was going to get out would be difficult. Then she saw rowing longboats tied up to the rickety jetty, and then realised that would be her means of entry to hell. A dead cat floated by, rats swimming to get to swollen, distort carcasses. Women were chained, jangled along the river's edge, the soldiers escorting them, herding them roughly down the narrow walkway. 2 by 2, they had been shuffled carefully. None of them could swim, so they had no wish to fall into the fetid water. Each had carried the chains that were attached to their feet and their wrists. They were all mangled. Whoever thought she would be arrested for such a petty thing? She had no idea how long she'd been imprisoned. Already months? A year? One night had been too long for her, and she'd been there for many nights. Her filthy clothing, she had no money. She'd missed out on the hand packet by the group of ladies. She had run out, and there were no others like to share. She had nothing but what she wore. Now this? She thought back to the days that she last saw her big brother. A sob caught her. She thought she had a vision when the sailors looked at him. No, wait, it was him. The sailor on the dock was her brother Jimmy. What was he doing here? How did he get that uniform? One day she was get to ask him. One day. The line of 30 women had made it to the jetty safely. Jimmy slided up to her. Under the guise of berating her for something, he handed down her a leather coin purse. She pretended to trip and shoved it down her exposed cleavage. She checked the strings that they were tugged in and not visible. Jimmy had reached out to stabilize her and slipped her a note into her hand. It looked as if he was assisting her in regaining her balance. This went unnoticed. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked. She turned, and knowing that she wasn't allowed to speak, she turned back, and the other soldiers mouthed thank you to her brother. He whispered back to her, "I love you. Don't you give up. I'll find you." She would lay down on the dark wooden pallet. Tears were sliding down her cheek at the memory of his words to her. She remembered she had shaken her head. Too dangerous. She whispered. It was so that he would hear. "Trust me," he whispered back. "No, don't do anything." She shook him, knowing that if anything happened to her, he could be injured. "Just let me get on the next ship." Jimmy had an idea. He slid his arm along her shoulder and pretended to kiss her. He whispered that he cared and would not stop praying. Another soldier came up and growled at Jimmy for fraternizing with the whores. Leave the government and covered the lice, or the crabs will get you, and if you let them touch you. Whilst they were talking, she shoved her note down the front with her purse. Hopefully she would get a chance to read it later. The soldiers walked to the end of the jetty and started loading them on the women first to the longboats. Jimmy slipped another thing into her hand, a small leather-bound parcel, obviously a book. She swung around and looked at him. She knew from the size what it was. It was joined to her purse down her front. She had a grin as she winked at her Bible. Now she was in Parramatta for her last night. She'd been here for more than 6 months. They had frozen and unheated rooms through the cold winters. She laid on the hard pallet and stared into the darkness. Her nose had become the stench of the unwashed bodies. She had closed her eyes to sleep, but the memory kept flooding back. She sat on the hulk for months. She could read her tiny Bible only at noon when the sliver of light entered through the hatch and gave her some light. For most of the time, she just sat in the gloom and existed for what time she could. They were locked below deck. Most of the time, the river cats were constantly her companions. Even some of them ate them. Even though at again her dry wrench with disgust. Amelia made friends with one of the other women who didn't belittle her for reading. Mary Adams wanted to read it too, but so in the dim light the two women sat and read letter by letter and word by word. Mary grasped the idea of reading. She was so excited that at least one woman with whom she could talk with. Mary moved into the other half of Amelia's wooden bunk. It was near the end sector of the ship, out of view of the soldiers. They would often come to claim the women for a bit of mild relief for their boredom. They were ready to volunteer their services for extra food rations. Many and two of their friends were not worried as such of demands. It had been winter when they were taken to the hulks. As the days were getting hotter, it must have been near summer. One day, another ship came along by and took women on board. "Welcome aboard to the Marley, my dears." The well-dressed gentleman was serious. "I am Dr. Reed, and I shall be sailing with you." The doctor kept welcoming the women as they boarded the gangplank from the hulk to the ship. He changed the banter as they walked and tried to raise their morale, as such women were difficult. Master Arthur Brown frowned at the cheerfulness at the surgeon. "Sheesh! Cheerful and brute, isn't he?" he said to one of his first mate. The first mate nodded in reply. Dr. Reed looked at the riverbank and then pulled Amelia and Mary aside. "Hey, you two are quite clean. Could you please help me with some medicals? I don't suppose either of you can read." Amelia politely admitted that they both did. "Sir, we both do read well." "Good, assist me. I need you clean too. You'll have to go to wash." The doctor wondered what their reaction would be. He had to get them aside somehow. This was the easiest thing he could do. He was so pleasantly surprised by a well-speaked modern. Sir, we both relish the opportunity to clean ourselves up properly. We have not had relinquished facilities to do so in our previous accommodations." Yes, he had the correct girls. Phew. The doctor raised a bushy eyebrow. "You girls' name? Where are you from?" "Amelia. West," she said with hesitation. "And I be Mary Adams, sir," Mary added in a cockiness accent. "West, huh? You from Kent? You sound like it," the doctor asked. "Yes, sir," she replied. "Good." He saw Master Arthur Brown walk away and leave them chatting. "Miss West, Jemmy sent me," he whispered. "Trust me." He saw her eyes fly open and she nodded, then released a deep sigh as he motioned for her to come forward. "Look." Jimmy was at there waving madly. No longer in uniform, he'd just come to say farewell. She turned stupendously and waved back. Jimmy blew her a kiss and put his hands together to tell her that he would be praying for her. She could only nod in reply, lifting his hands forward. The doctor turned to the captain. "Captain Brown, I claim these two to be my assistants. They seem to be the cleanest of them all." The doctor had his back to her but heard the grasp. "I'll be having them in the tiny room next to my cabin. Chain them if you must, but do not waste my time scrubbing them every time I need help." Master Marina Arthur Brown scowled but nodded. Fine, but they're both your responsibility. Is that clear? Both the doctor and Amelia sighed with relief. Once the rest of the women were aboard, some 120 of them, the doctor escorted the two women to the tiny cabin and he ushered them inside and closed the door. Miss West, Miss Adams, we must keep our voices down. Your brother Jimmy has asked me to assist you if I can. I need you to both play along, but I will keep you both safe. Is that understood? You'll earn your keep and really will assist me. The harder you work, the better the privileges. I'll be able to get you. Both girls nodded. Amelia wept with relief. Anything, sir. Thank you so much, she said quietly. All right, the first thing we need to do is do a medical check of everyone on board. Miss West, can you scribe to Miss Adams and you will be assisting me in handing me things? Can you do that? Again, both girls nodded. He then left to wash and change the nondescript calico gown on the bunks. So the 5-month trip started. Their cabin was breathless but clean. Even the rats didn't enter the scruffy room. The doctor kept them all clean and healthy. The crew made them free with the women below deck. As assistants, they were protected from their attention, but they often heard squeals from the brandy laughing coming from below deck. But by the time they reached Sydney in September, nearly half of the women were with child. On the arrival to Sydney, the doctor said his farewells to Amelia and said that he'd be praying for her. He'd taken Amelia aside before they arrived and handed her a £10 note that Jimmy had given for her. She thanked him and placed it carefully with her Bible and tucked them down to her bodice into her corset. He stood as he sadly watched the two women rejoin the others. They were taken to the female factory in Parramatta. None of them had died on this trip, and thankfully the assistant of the two girls had shown them that the other cleanliness brought reward. Over the months on the hulks, the coins in the purse had saved them many, many situations. She had 6 left, the £10 note, and she had safely in her Bible. She sewed the remaining coins into the bodice of her gown and eked them away. The note that Jimmy sent to be her assurance of his love and his continued care for her, and the last parcel with him was her tiny Bible. It was small enough to stuff down her corset and lay flat on her ribs. The feeling of the comfort, the leather wrap had protected it all this time as she slept and took it with her everywhere. She drew a deep breath knowing that she must sleep, unaware of what tomorrow would bring, for tomorrow would be her assigned, farming out for some person to work for the next 5 or so years. She prayed that someone kind would find her. She had managed to find some clean water and washed, including her face. Oh, and she wished to be clean again, like that on the ship. Sadly, she'd become used to the stench and the filth of the others at the factory. Jimmy had said, trust him. She said, but for how long? He said that the doctor, even though he was long gone, she heard a water coming in from the night liaison with some other willing women. She had managed to belay that final humiliation, and there were others more willing to obligate it. Finally, she slept. This has been Amelia Tears by Amelia Pouted. The book is now available on Amazon, so please, if you can, head to amazon.com.au and read Amelia's Tears. Thank you so much for listening.